Once you go through the accountability process, then the healing begins. If you don't do that and you ignore the pain, that's not healing. That's denial. That's pushing things under the rug. And again, the ways in which America has failed to deal with this white supremacy issue manifests itself in the ways that we deal with people globally. So we hurt ourselves and we ultimately hurt people.
That's the voice of Terrell Jermaine Starr, founder and host of the foreign policy podcast, Black Diplomats. He's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Michelle Dover and Tom Colleen.
Welcome back to Press the Button. Tomorrow, we'll be watching the inauguration on television as President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris take the helm of the U.S. government in Washington, D.C.
We'll have plenty of reporting on what the new administration is doing and should do on nuclear policy in the weeks ahead. But for now, we'd like to extend our hearty congratulations to everyone involved with the Biden-Harris team. And we look forward to working with you to strengthen our collective nuclear security.
Tom, what do you have lined up for us on Early Warning?
Today, we'll be talking with Beyond the Bomb about how to keep the issue of sole authority alive even after President Trump leaves office, and why we need a new policy to prevent the first use of nuclear weapons, and what advocacy groups are doing to build momentum for common sense reform.
After that, I sit down with Terrell Jermaine Starr, the host of Black Diplomats, a weekly foreign policy podcast devoted to Black and people of color-led conversations on safety and national security. We talk about what the Biden-Harris inauguration means for the undercurrents of militarism and white supremacy in our country that we saw so vividly on display earlier this month, and how the way we approach domestic issues bleeds over into our foreign policy in ways that not everyone realizes.
And finally, I answer a question about what day one of the Biden presidency could look like in terms of nuclear policy. And remember, if you would like your question answered on the air, tweet or DM us at PressButtonPod, or send us an email at pressthebutton@plowshares.org. We would love to hear from you.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating wherever you get your podcasts. Word of mouth from our listeners is what drives this. So thank you, thank you, thank you. But with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Del. This episode will air on January 19th, one day before the inauguration. At a typical inauguration, the military aide carrying the nuclear football would follow the departing president to the event and then leave with the new president. The transfer of nuclear authority is seamless and hardly noticed. This time it's more complicated because President Trump has said he will not be at the inauguration. So presumably wherever President Trump is at noon that day, his football will be shut down and a different military aide with a different football will start to follow President Biden. And this, of course, is the briefcase that contains all that the president needs to start a nuclear war. So on one level, as of noon on January 20th, we can all breathe a sigh of relief. Trump, who has been impeached for being a clear and present danger to the nation, will no longer control the nuclear arsenal. But on a deeper level, this danger of giving one person the sole authority to launch nuclear weapons will stay with us and must still be addressed. And our guests today are two people who are on the front lines of trying to make sure this issue does not go away with President Trump. Yasmeen Silva is Partnerships Manager at Beyond the Bomb, and Colleen Moore is Digital Engagement Manager, also at Beyond the Bomb. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you for having us.
So tell us, you are deeply, deeply engaged in this, and thank you both for all your work on this issue. why should the public just not forget about this issue once Trump is gone?
I think what we've seen over the past 4 years with the Trump presidency is really the nuclear system and the danger that's inherent with the way that it's been conceived laid bare. But that doesn't mean that the danger will go away unless and until we can take concrete steps to reduce nuclear risk. I don't think anyone wants to find themselves in the position that we do now. Think about how many people since the 6th have woken up and realized that because of the way this convoluted system that's kind of been kept in the background of government, that they have been implicitly trusting an aggressive, inciting, self-serving man with the fate of the world. But that no matter who the following president is, we can't take that risk. We can't wait for something to happen to make change, because with nuclear weapons, by then it will be far too late.
Now, your group has been pushing a particular, promoting a particular answer here. I mean, there are many possible fixes to sole authority, but you've been promoting no first use. Tell us why.
So no first use would prevent the United States from launching a nuclear first strike. So it would effectively prevent the U.S. from ever starting a nuclear war. So we see no first use as effectively ending sole authority to start a nuclear war. Under the current system, one person has this power to start a nuclear war at any time, for any reason, and no one can refuse that order. So no first use would make this first use of nuclear weapons illegal, which would clearly limit the circumstances under which a president's nuclear launch authority could be executed. So that's why we see no first use as a solution to the sole authority problem.
And how would you go about that? I mean, is this something you'd like to achieve through legislation or through an act of the president? What's the best way to get there?
I think for us, that's through legislation. And so my background, and Colleen's as well, it comes from progressive organizing outside of the nuclear space, actually. And a lesson that I've learned there is that wins, and while I do want to make sure that we count things that happen by executive passage as a win, they're easily changed. I think what we've seen with the policy known as the global gag rule, this has become something as a touchstone at the beginning of any change of administration between Republican and Democrat. As soon as a Democrat comes into office, they repeal it. And as soon as a Republican president is in office, they reinstate it. And when we're talking, and obviously that is horrible, and we need to make sure that that's fixed. But when we're talking about something as world-altering as nuclear weapons, I don't think we can leave that up to a change of administration. We need true, concrete legislative change to make sure that this isn't left up to the whim and fancy of whoever's in office.
And now tell me, last question, what is Beyond the Bomb and the other groups that you're working with doing right now to build support for no first use?
So Beyond the Bomb comes at this issue from a few different angles. We have a field program, so we work with a lot of young people. We have a fellowship program, so we're working with young progressive activists who come from a variety of different progressive backgrounds. They're working on so many different issues, and really working with them on how the dangers of nuclear weapons are related to so many different issues. The second part of that is like the communications angle. So we send a lot of digital action alerts to constituents and key members, districts to galvanize support for no first use. Yasmeen can also, of course, talk about the partnerships angle of that. So digitally and using this communications angle, we're really taking advantage of big moments like we're in right now. with Trump inciting an insurrection. He's been banned from social media, but he still has the nuclear codes. And there's so many people talking about that. So it's a really great entry point. I've really seen Trump as an entry point to talk about a lot of these issues of sole authority. So we've put together this joint petition to galvanize people from inside the nuclear community as well as outside to point to this moment as an opportunity to say, this is why we need no first use. Yes, we need to remove Trump. Yes, we need to get him out of office, but it's a bigger problem than that.
And if people wanted to get involved in this effort, what should they do?
So people can sign our joint petition calling on members of Congress to pass no first use, and the link will be provided to go to that petition. You can go to our website and see the variety of actions we have on our website as well, and how to follow us on social media and keep up with what we're doing.
Excellent. And for listeners out there, we will provide that link on the resources to this podcast. Yasmeen, anything you want to add about what people can do?
I think if folks want to get more involved, besides being able to join individually to our joint petition, you can also sign up your organization to co-sponsor to show support. But I think it's also thinking about who you interact with, both within the nuclear space and outside of, who you can be having these conversations with. Something that I'm spending a lot of my time doing right now is connecting with other folks who are working on issues of executive authority, whether that be in the nuclear space or outside of it. Folks working on AUMF. There are so many other fights that are happening right now that the insurrection and honestly the entire Trump presidency has brought to the fore. But this is such a galvanizing moment for us to make sure that when we are fighting for change, we are doing so in lockstep with other folks. And so I would encourage and I would challenge you to think about how our issue intersects with all of those other fights for positive change we're seeing people calling for right now. And because honestly, your circles are probably broader than you think, who you might know, who you can be having a conversation with and connecting with on that issue. And I welcome anyone who has thoughts. Also, you can reach out to me, go to our website, beyondthebomb.org, follow us on Twitter. We're really looking to have conversations with folks right now. So I think that's another great way for people to plug in and get involved.
Yasmeen, Colleen, there is the siren. Our time is up. Thank you so much for being here.
Terrell Jermaine Starr is the host of Black Diplomats, a weekly podcast devoted to Black and people of color-led conversations on safety and national security. You might have also seen his reporting at The Root, where he's a senior reporter and writes about the 2020 election cycle and foreign policy, mostly U.S. relations with Ukraine and Russia. Terrell, I am thrilled to have you on the show. Thank you for taking time from your travels in Uzbekistan to call in.
Hey, of course, I'm happy to be here. We're 10 hours ahead, by the way, for those who are curious.
I hope your day is starting out well, and that the future hours ahead of us look good.
Yeah, me too.
So let's just start with the inauguration. And with the news from Georgia, we are now finally approaching the end of this election cycle. You've been covering this from the beginning. What's your big takeaway?
Well, the big takeaway is that you have two Democrats, in John Ossoff and Reverend Raphael Warnock, who definitely believe in diplomacy and have anti-war mindsets, particularly as it pertains to Iran. You'll have two people entering the U.S. Senate who will most likely, again, they'll support the Iran deal. They'll definitely be very proactive in ensuring that the Biden administration moves into not only a new start, but to create a new policy treaty with Russia that I think people who are watching these parts of the world from a non-proliferation perspective can lead to a more to a more workable relationship. The other thing is that we see a lot of America's flaws. Even before that, right? We saw America's flaws, but we see that many people in America, many white people, you just have to call it out for what it is, do not care in democracy, do not care about national security. They care about their security, right? And so it just unravels this idea of American exceptionalism that dictates to the rest of the world that we have the moral fiber and character to know what's best for you. We have the moral fiber and character to determine what safety is. And so out of the victories in Georgia came success for those in the non-proliferation world, but it also shows you the hypocrisy of the American exceptionalist mindset and framework that suggests that Washington gets to determine who in the world has a right to determine what safety is and isn't.
I'm so glad you said this, because I was going to say, this week we're going to be seeing the Biden-Harris administration take office. And I think with it, there's a lot of people out there who will be breathing a sigh of relief that President Trump will no longer have sole authority to launch nuclear weapons. But to your point, while the symptom is lessening, the illness, the militarism, exceptionalism, and white supremacy that has led to these outcomes is still there. So what do we do about it?
We have to divest from neoliberalism, right? So, and that's not a partisanship. That's not a Democrat issue or a Republican issue. America has become too devoted to this idea of allowing an unchecked free market to determine job security, to determine safety, to determine security. So when you think about neoliberalism in our military industrial complex, for example, think about the fact that so much of our military budget, our objectives, who determines the type of spending that takes place in the Pentagon is all predicated on politicians from all parties who rely on defense spending, defense dollars and defense contributions. So, and it's interesting when you talk to elected officials the way that I do, you begin to realize that, one, there's a very lazy thinking about what defines safety and security. So you can even talk about Democrats, for example, when you think about crime. So many elected officials, and this dates back to the 70s, the 80s with the war, with the war on drugs, for example, they get into office by saying that we're going to be tough on crime. We're going to throw more police at the problem. We're going to throw more cops on the street. And so there is never a real challenging and robust intellectual conversation about urban planning or schooling or about about housing insecurity, about food insecurity. And so the idea is to just throw more police and everything. Why am I saying this? Because this very domestic mindset of using more police carries over into the foreign affairs component where we say, okay, if there's a country out there who we don't like and we don't have the patience to deal with them, or we determine that they're not somebody that we can benefit from, then we throw more military at them, right? So you also think about the idea that there are a lot of elected officials who look at defense jobs in their districts as job growth and job security. And so we know that according to the War Project at Boston University, that defense jobs do not equal it's not a reliable job creator. So it stems from decades of neoliberal mindset on security. And so both parties are going to have to divest from that if they really are going to make any headway into the very issues that we are dealing with. So I think that it is going to require people to become more creative. Is really pushing both sides to really take a really hard look at white supremacy. So when we see the impeachment process taking place, you'll see a lot of people. It was mainly Republicans, but you'll also find some Democrats. They use the words healing and the country needs to move on. Joe Biden has said that. And, as somebody who has grown up, in the hood per se, or who grew up around violence, and somebody who's understood urban planning, you really, growing up and looking at the people around me who entered the drug business and who went to prison for violent crime, my process of forgiving the people who impacted me, it starts with accountability, right? It starts with people saying that I harmed you and I'm sorry, and I want to go through the process so that you feel more secure and feel safer. Once you go through the accountability process, then the healing begins. If you don't do that and you ignore the pain, that's not healing. That's denial. That's pushing things under the rug. And again, the ways in which America has failed to deal with this white supremacy issue manifests itself in the ways that we deal with people globally. So we hurt ourselves and we ultimately hurt people. So America is in a very self-destructive relationship with itself. And because of its robust hegemonic influence in the rest of the world, our allies and people like Iran and in Russia that have a very complex and nuanced dynamics in their own societies, they're being unwittingly harmed by that as well. And it makes for poor foreign policy because we have poor domestic policy.
Okay, at this point, I just have to give a plug for this latest episode on your podcast, Black Diplomats, that you did with LaTosha Brown, the co-founder of Black Voters Matter. And what I really appreciated about it was getting into these relationships between how this mindset of, using violence in order to keep the peace, we do it at home and we do it abroad. And so how do nuclear weapons fit into that? Because I know in a lot of my studies, people like to put them on this pedestal as a weapon apart, right? Just even the classification of, it's a weapon of mass destruction. How do you see those fitting in?
Well, for starters, I recently interviewed Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who said that nuclear weapons are an equal opportunity destroyer. So it doesn't matter what color you are, right? It doesn't matter your creed, doesn't matter your religion. If a bomb drops, it's not going to discriminate against somebody because of how they look or anything like that. But it's really the nuclear weapon is a manifestation, again, of America's relationship with violence. And so America has determined that because we have the biggest guns, because we have the largest military, we can decide on who is a threat and who isn't. So just as American nuclear posture determines that Iran is a threat, that Russia is a threat, that North Korea is a threat, mind you, the same type of culture, the lack of cultural understanding and know-how that many U.S. lawmakers and policymakers have about Black people, about our Latinx communities, about our non-white population, that transfers over into the foreign policy element, right? And so I think that with nuclear weapons, you think about the costs of it, right? Think about, I'll give you a prime example. So when you think about, I'll give you a defund the police example and tie that to the ground mid-court system, right? So there was a New York Times study or analysis that determined that many police departments around America do not spend a majority of their time pursuing crime or pursuing work that deals with people who commit violent acts. Much of that time, in fact, deals with traffic tickets. It deals with issues that don't require armed law enforcement. And when you think about divesting from that system, it doesn't necessarily mean that we are going to completely take away the enforcement capacity. So It simply means that you're taking more money from this idea of safety, something that you think makes you feel safe. You're looking at the budget and saying, hey, we can take this 20% and 30% of the people who are doing traffic violations, everything and put people who don't have weapons in these roles. Take away the responsibility of police officers to respond to mental health crises and replace them with healthcare workers. And here's another thing. It also presumes that a person who has a mental health problem is automatically going to respond with violence, which is not true. So how does that tie into nuclear weapons? The same mentality. As long as I have a nuclear weapon, that makes me feel safe. And we all know that that's not true. I'm bringing up the ground mid-course system, for example. Hundreds of millions of dollars, and in fact, it may well be billions at this point, has been devoted to a ground mid-course system that does not work. And for those who are listening who don't know what a ground mid-course system is, it's supposed to be the defense system that is supposed to shoot projectiles into the air to stop a warhead from making contact with U.S. territory. And we all know that the vast majority of those tests it's failed. And those ground mid-course system tests are planned. And we all know that when someone decides that they're going to attack America, it's not like North Korea or, they're going to call and say, hey, Washington, we're going to drop, an ICBM on you soon, or we're going to drop a submarine launched ballistic missile. Get ready so you can put throw that projectile that we know doesn't work. We're get ready to shoot it and let's just see how far it goes. No, they're not going to do that. And so we have to think about the fact that we need to get rid of that altogether. Now, people will say, how are we going to protect ourselves? Well, here's the thing. It never protected us anyway, because when someone delivers an ICBM and, and it makes it over to where we are, more than one warhead is going to fall on us. And that ground mid-course system is not going to hit all of them. Okay, let's just start there. So what is the alternative? Well, we can talk our way into peace because the last time I checked, we could say whatever we want to say about Russian President Vladimir Putin. I don't think that he's suicidal. We can say what we want about the Iranian government in Tehran. I don't think they have a death wish either. They want to live. And Kim Jong-un, for all of the caricatures of the racist ones, mind you, and if you want to ask, we can get into that, the racist caricatures of him as a child, the way that he is depicted in media. Yes, he is a dictator, all those things. Yeah, that's true. But I don't think he wants a death wish either. And because ultimately, we're never going to be 100% secure. And a weapon is not going to assure that. It never has. It didn't stop the 9/11 attacks, right? So, and it doesn't stop any of these others. It doesn't prevent cyber attacks from happening. It doesn't stop Russian interference. And so the world has realized that, yes, you have a military. Yes, you have the nuclear bomb, but we can destroy you in other ways. And it's effective and it's destabilizing. And so people really need to rethink what makes them feel safe. And if we haven't gotten to the point where the nuclear bomb has not prevented COVID-19, that it has not prevented cyber attacks, that it has not prevented political interference, then we need to rethink who, as an American people, we're sending to Washington, because we need some new thinking there. I'll bring up North Korea, and I'll also bring up Iran. So the very nature of American U.S. Nuclear posture is racist, okay? And the reason why is that U.S. nuclear posture, it determines who is a threat and who isn't. But and most importantly, it determines that Iran and North Korea and Russia are not entitled to feel threatened. Okay. And what does that mean? It means that we don't have to respect the concerns of people who we've designated to be terrorists. And we often do that without even thinking about it. So, for example, let's go to North Korea. Americans decide which people become a problem. So we can, even though the hijackers of the planes that flew into the buildings here on September 11th of 2001 come from Saudi Arabia, does that stop America from conducting business with Saudi Arabia? Has that ever prevented us from selling weapons to Saudi Arabia? No, it hasn't, right? And so we know that we can also be in a position where we can say, okay, North Korea, we can negotiate a truce on nuclear issues while still holding sanctions against the North Korean government over its human rights abuses. So you can walk and chew bubble gum at the same time. And for whatever reason, America has decided that we're not going to provide that nuance to North Korea. We're not going to provide that nuance to Iran. We're not going, well, we do it with Russia more or less, but basically we're not going to provide this nuance to mainly to North Korea and to Iran. And here's the reason why the U.S. elections are so important. So much of our approach towards more so towards Iran than it is North Korea. There's this religious orthodoxy about protecting Israel, right? And the reality is that most white American evangelicals don't give a damn about Israel's national security. Israel is a proxy through which white evangelicals who heavily support conservative members of Congress as a means to strengthen their own orthodoxy about Christian faith. So it's not about Israeli national security. With Raphael Warnock entering the Senate, you're going to have a religious moral force on the Democratic side, an anti-war moral force that will push back against the religious orthodoxy of conservative militarism towards Iran. And so it's not so much about the technicalities of what Iran can do and what it can't do, or North Korea. It's really about the narrative that we create about who's the enemy and who is not, right? So the both of us can get into the technicalities, Michelle, about, okay, we know that Iran, they're enriching uranium up to 20%. They made that announcement. So we can get into the technicalities about that, but it's not really about that. It isn't. It's not. It's really about the narrative. And ultimately, we need an enemy. The United States needs an adversary because it plays into this model of protecting the homeland. And it goes into this idea of protecting the white patronage of the American citizen. That's what it is about. It needs someone to fight. And for many people in U.S. politics, if you don't have an enemy, you really don't have a reason to exist. So what you do is that you create these racist caricatures about people, very similarly to how the insurrectionists in Washington waged war essentially against his own country because they were not happy with the fact that Black people were self-determining in Georgia. Who could have thought that Georgia would be a competitive state, that it turned blue? In one instance, it's not a real blue state, it's a purple state, but it turned blue this year. But Black people were self-determined. And so that's what those insurrectionists were fighting against in Washington. It manifested itself in foreign policy.
So speaking of enemies, with the time we have left, I want to talk about Russia. And as I mentioned earlier, you're calling in from Uzbekistan. You travel frequently throughout the former Soviet Union, and you're a scholar of this region. As you know, Joe Biden needs to extend New START, the last remaining arms control treaty between the U.S. and Russia, before February 5th. But other than that, it seems like the U.S. is likely to not look at Russia favorably, especially given the news of the SolarWinds hack. What do you think the new administration needs to keep in mind? And I think more broadly, what do you think Americans miss when it comes to understanding the Russian government's behavior?
Let's deal directly with the recent hack or news of it, right? And I'm probably going to have a lot of people push back against this, but I'm going to go ahead and say it. This recent hack is ultimately inconsequential. When it comes to the grand scheme of things of our long-term relationship with the Kremlin, this recent hack is inconsequential because we're going to have to work with them anyway. Okay. And in regards to New START, America is going to have to make a decision on at what point do we believe that our current stockpile is more than enough and that Russia can go on doing whatever it wishes, but we are going to go towards a path of peace. It should reconsider pursuing Obama's sincere effort for a nuclear-free world. And what do I mean by that? Under the Obama administration, we've seen the fewer cuts to their arsenal in regards to retirement of nuclear warheads. And I'm not talking about the New START treaty in regards to the reductions of deployed warheads. I'm talking about our overall stockpiles, right? I'm talking about the idea that the number of retired warheads and dismantling of weapons. So it happened at least under Obama. And the reason being is that unlike Ronald Reagan, who was dealing with a Gorbachev or who was dealing with, or the previous presidents before Putin, you dealt with somebody who ultimately didn't want to play ball, right? So Obama, it was a matter of bad timing in many respects. So that's my opinion about it. But moving forward, you're going to be dealing with people who are experienced in dealing with Moscow. It's just, you're going to deal with the bare minimum of competent leadership. But so that's going to happen. But what do Americans get wrong? Americans too often don't respect the fact that we are not that much different from Russia in regards to being an imperial power. So in 2016, when Russia when the Kremlin meddled in the U.S. election, people responded to it with shock and with condemnation. And my response was, Russia is an imperial nation. They're supposed to do that. Okay? That's what imperial nations do. That's what America does. It inserts its influence around the world. And that includes interfering. So it's almost as if we don't know, it's good for the rest of the world, but it's not good for us. Now, I'm not saying that I approve or I wanted a foreign country to meddle in our election, but my response to Americans is, how do you think other nations feel about America meddling in their affairs? And so that's very difficult for Americans to process. And again, it goes back to this very privileged, arrogant, hegemonic mindset that America has always had. And then Russia, for the first time, for many Americans, told you that we can play that game too. So we really have to realize that we have to ask ourselves, how much neoliberalism do we want? And what type of course do we want to go down in order so that does not happen? That doesn't include more weapons. And so with Russia, it's important to note that they have their own views of the world, right? So, for example, I don't necessarily agree with Russia. Not necessarily agree. Russia was completely wrong for invading Ukraine. And so the sanctions need to be stronger. Obama should have provided more weapons to Ukraine so it could defend itself. And also, America can't do it by itself. America cannot really have a robust policy towards Russia without European Union support. So, but there's another thing too. We also have to understand what Russia wants. Russia has long felt surrounded by NATO. Russia has always felt threatened. And so even though you're not going to necessarily give Russia what it wants, you need to understand their fears. You need to understand what their concerns are. And it just can't be this paintbrush of we're going to get 100% of what we want and Russia isn't. And just from a pure power dynamic standpoint, that's not going to completely happen because Russia has leverage over us in certain ways. And so in another thing, too, there's so many business ties between Russia and America and Russia and the European Union. And so you're going to have to look at your business community and say, for the sake of America and our country, is it worth conducting business with Russian oligarchs who violate the integrity of American political institutions? So it's a wide-ranging issue, again, that deals with neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is the main flaw here. And if we divest from that, then war is going to be less of an option. But there's a problem with too many Americans who believe that if we use violence, then that's going to protect us. And as Russia showed us, we don't have to use our military. We can just hack you to death and make you miserable, because they've been doing that for much of their existence. So they don't have to use a military against us in order to destabilize us and feel weak. And so it requires some new thinking. And I'm not even sure if the Biden administration, because they're very neoliberal and they're very centrist in their own politics and their own approaches of the world. So I'm not sure that they're going to break away from that anytime soon. But if I were advising this administration I've had, and if anybody would listen to me, I would go down that path, because, being, tough against, Russia, it doesn't work with them, because again, they already feel like they already feel like they're disrespected. And it's very difficult for a lot of people to hear, but we can be forceful in using sanctions against Russia, but also being able to work with them on nuclear weapons non-proliferation. Because here's the thing, they can't really afford, their country, there are so many people in their country, they're in poverty too. They need divestment as well. So all of this time, and I'll close with saying this, in all of the media attention that has been directed towards the Russians, quote unquote, and the Kremlin, quote unquote, we don't know a damn thing about Russian culture. We don't know a damn thing about Russians in their day-to-day life. And we see that's gotten us anywhere. And so if we take this non-neoliberal approach, then we'll begin to understand what they want, and that's going to lead us to more peace. Whether or not the Biden administration will take a more nuanced approach remains to be seen. But I think that based on the events that's happening here in the United States and what's happening around the world, I think that's the more viable option.
Terrell, I could talk to you for a lot longer, but this podcast, unfortunately, has time limits. Where can our listeners go to find Black Diplomats?
Okay, so Black Diplomats is a foreign policy podcast about safety and security. And you can download the podcast on your favorite platforms, particularly Apple Podcasts, Spotify, for example. But we're available on all platforms. Search for Black Diplomats and you'll find us. And you should also consider contributing to our Patreon, also under Black Diplomats.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining, and safe travels.
Thank you.
Letters, we get letters, we get stacks and stacks of letters.
And now, everyone's favorite nuclear question and answer segment. Are you ready for this, Tom?
Bring it on, Michelle.
Brady from Massachusetts asks, in a perfect world, what is the one thing on nuclear policy you would like to see the Biden administration do on day one?
Thanks, Michelle. And thanks, Brady from Massachusetts. That's the toughest question of all to answer when you ask for one thing, right? I could come up with 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 things, but if you have to boil it down to one, that's really hard. And I will try to respect your challenge. So if I had to choose one thing, I think it would have to be for President Biden on day one to address the situation that we have been living with for 4 years and has become so apparent as of last week and the riots on the Capitol. Which is that, we cannot allow one person to have sole authority over nuclear weapons. And it is now so clear to all that one person could wind up being an unhinged President Trump, who simply cannot be trusted with the power to end our civilization as we know it. And as much as we're all going to breathe a sigh of relief when President Biden inherits the nuclear football from President Trump, that's not the end of the story, because we could have another Trump-like figure in our future. We've had unstable presidents in the past. There's no guarantees we won't have presidents like that in the future. And so we simply can't assume that this issue will go away when President Trump leaves office. So President Biden can do a huge amount to put limits on presidential sole authority. I think the best, most complete, most holistic way to do that would be to declare that the United States will never use nuclear weapons first. In other words, the United States would never start a nuclear war, but would only use nuclear weapons in retaliation to an attack on the United States or its allies and friends. If we had a no first use policy in effect today, we would feel so much more reassured about President Trump in the White House, because he would not be able to use nuclear weapons unless we had already been attacked with nuclear weapons. This, to me, is the one existential danger that we face that could end the world and the civilization in a day. Of course, we face many other dangers, but none of them are that immediate and that absolute. So my one, if I have to choose one thing that President Biden would do on day one, it would be to announce that the United States will never start a nuclear war.
Another week, another question. Thank you, Tom, and thank you for narrowing it down to just one. I know that's hard. And thank you, Brady, for your question. And remember, if you would like us to get your question on the air, tweet or DM us at PressButtonPod or send us an email at pressthebutton@plowshares.org.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Sender, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Sender. Audio engineering by Derek Sender and Will Lowry. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.